Hi, I'm Johnny from UltimatePaperMache.com, and this week I made a model of a fox's face. This is him out of wet clay. And then I used some stuff called Rebound 25. It's silicone in order to make a mold for it. And then I put paper strips and paste inside, and I created a copy. I could actually create as many copies as I want to because now I have the mold. Now, you might be wondering why you would want to do this, and there's actually several reasons. I'm pretty sure quite a few of the people out on Etsy.com who sell paper mache products do it this way. If you have a design that you really like and other people really like it too, then you're going to have to make a whole bunch of them. And you couldn't afford to make every single one of them from scratch, not unless you're one of those really high-end people who are selling something for thousands of dollars. That'd be nice, but most of us aren't there yet. So we would want to create the original model, probably with clay. You can use either wet clay like I do or an oil-based clay, then make your mold, and then produce copies of them. You can go ahead and embellish these any way you want to with some eyebrows and fur or whatever after the paper mache itself is dry, but you don't have to start everyone from scratch. It would just totally save so much time. Now, another reason could be that your school or community center or your vacation Bible school is going to put on a play, and the characters are going to be wearing masks, and for some reason there's a whole lot of the actors who have to wear the same mask. You got a whole herd of something. So in a case like that, you're not going to want to make every single one of those masks all by itself. You're going to want to make a mold like this one. As a matter of fact, that'd be a really good way for one person to create the design and then have volunteers or other people produce the mask themselves in the mold. Now, if you want just one of something, in this case a mask, this is one that I made of a really old African mask, and I just sculpted that in clay and put the paper mache right on top of it. I'll leave a link to that video down below. That's a fairly fast process, so if you only need one mask, that would be the way to do it. I've got a whole bunch of videos on my channel and on my website that show you how to make four-legged animals, just one at a time, using an armature made out of crumpled foil or paper, and then you put paper mache or paper mache clay over it. That's an easy process too, for just one. But if you want 10 of them for a play, or maybe 200 or 300 in order to sell, then you're going to want to make a mold and do it that way so that you don't have to start from scratch every single time. I am going to jump in here really fast. I was just getting ready to put this video up on YouTube, and I realized that there was something I was going to say and I forgot. If you watched my last video about the grinning bonobo that I made in clay, and I was thinking about making a silicone mold for it, and you're wondering why it turned into a fox, that was kind of because I didn't want that great big grin to be the first thing I saw every single morning before my cup of coffee. But I did make one. I made a small one out of clay, and I did make a silicone mold exactly the same way that I'm going to show you today, but I cast it in plaster. If you have any interest in knowing why I would want to go to the trouble of making a silicone mold when I only wanted one item, then be sure and let me know down in the comments below. Okay, I'm out of here. Now this is going to be a little bit longer video than I usually make, so let's get right to it. I want to show you how this is done. The first thing that I did was take the ears off. I roughly sculpted the ears and added it to the fox just so that I could tell if it really looked like a fox or not. It doesn't look like a fox without any ears. But you don't want to trap clay inside of the silicone, and that would happen if you're making a one-part mold and you include a really long thin area like the ears. You wouldn't be able to put the paper mache in there, and it would be really hard even to get the clay out. So I just took the ears off. In this case, it's going to be easier for me to put one of the clay ears on a piece of cardboard and just trace around it. Then I'll make cardboard ears and add them to the paper mache mask after it's dry. Next, I used a sculpting tool. It has teeth along one edge. Smoothing it off as much as you can will really speed up the process of making your paper mache castings, because you can use larger pieces of paper. Obviously, you can't do that in some detailed areas like the nose and the eyes and whatnot, but smooth it off as much as you possibly can. It would really make a big difference when you're actually doing the more tedious work of putting those paper strips and paste inside of your mold. Then I use a soft brush. It's been dipped in water. This just smooths off the clay, makes a nice surface on the inside of your mold. I sculpted the basic shape of the fox's ruff, but I didn't sculpt individual hairs. If you have really, really tiny details like wrinkles and things, then the paper is just going to sit right on top of them. It's not going to actually form into really tiny details like hair or wrinkles. You can easily add those after the paper mache casting is dry. I filled in the edge around the bottom of the clay so the silicone wouldn't flow underneath it. Extra silicone can obviously be cut off after the mold is cured and hard, but it's really messy and it wastes the expensive material. So I just used a thin layer of my wet clay all around the bottom and then pressed the plastic into it. If you're using an oil-based clay, go ahead and use oil-based clay to fill in that little gap instead. I also made a dam around the back of the sculpture because I didn't want any of the silicone to be back there either. And then as soon as everything was all cleaned up, this is wet clay, so it needs to be sealed before I put any silicone on it. So I took it down into the basement and I sprayed it with this clear paint. The paint actually dries in about an hour over wet clay. But if you're using an oil-based clay for your model, you don't have to spray it. Just go ahead and start in with your silicone right away. I did put some gloves on. I always do. You don't want to use latex gloves though. You're also going to need a few other things like something to stir the silicone with. I use wood paint sticks. Now I'm also going to be using a cheap chip brush. I'm using Rebound 25 and it goes on really, really thin the very first layer. You can't really use a brush with the thickened layers, so I use a popsicle stick for those. You're also going to need some Thyvex thickener. I got a really big bottle about 20 years ago. I don't know why, because you only need a few drops. I will never have to buy any more, but you want to get a small bottle. You really don't need very much at one time. You can weigh the material. That's what is usually recommended in order to get exactly the same amount of Part A and Part B of your Rebound 25. But I'm not making a very big mold, so I'm just using these medicine cups to measure it instead, and it works just fine. I never know exactly how much I'm going to need, so I just make a guess. This time I decided to use 2 medicine cups of both Part A and Part B. I just used the paint sticks to get it into the medicine cups. Then I use a new paint stick and mix up the other part, so that you don't get any of Part A in the Part B bucket. You don't want to mix it up inside the buckets because you'll end up with little hard globs. It's the mixing of the material that actually causes it to start to cure. You want that to happen outside the bucket, not inside the bucket. And then I just put it in another cup. I just use these clear plastic cups that I get from the grocery store. The clear ones really help, and you'll see why on the next layer. Keep mixing it until there's no light and pink streaks in there. You want it to be all one color, and then as soon as you get it to that point, keep mixing it just a little bit more. You do want it to be mixed really well, including around the bottom and around the side. It does start to cure as soon as the 2 parts are mixed together, but you do have quite a long working time, so don't worry about that. Don't wander off and go have a cup of coffee or anything after you've mixed it together though. Do start putting it on your clay model right away. Like I said, I'm using a chip brush. I get tons of these. They're really cheap if you buy 50 of them at a time. You probably just want to go down to the hardware store and get some, or Walmart has them. You want your first layer to be really thin so that you can see any of the bubbles that happen to appear. You're always going to get air that's trapped inside of really deep areas like the nostrils or the corners of the eyes. So you always have to make sure that you go back over those and pop those bubbles. Otherwise you're going to have weird areas inside of your mold. Now while I'm showing you this part, I want to mention that after the whole mold is finished, I always make a master copy using plaster cloth, because that way, just in case something happens to the mold before I'm finished using it, I don't have to re-sculpt the fox. I have something that I can use to make a second mold if I absolutely have to. If you're using your molds to make items that you want to sell, you definitely want to make a master copy. You can use either plaster cloth like I do, or use poured plaster if your mold happens to be the right shape for that. Whatever it is you use, you definitely want to make a master copy though, because if you have a really hot selling item and your mold gets damaged or torn or lost, then you can go ahead and make another one and keep on producing that really good selling product. You don't want to be caught without a mold if you have sales coming in. You want to put some of the silicone around the outside edges of the model while you're working, because the what we call the mother mold, or the stiff outer shell that we're going to be creating, it's going to be sitting on that. So go ahead and put a little bit around the edges. I put some up on that dam that I made at the back too. And you also want to make sure that there isn't any air trapped under any parts of the project. Like in this case, the muzzle was kind of sticking up away from the base, and that's a really good spot for air to get trapped. You have to go back over that and make sure that there isn't any really big bubbles, because that can be a real problem in areas like that. If you have some extra silicone like I did, then go ahead and put it on over the clay on an area that doesn't have a lot of details. You don't want to put this extra part on this layer on the parts like the eyes or the nose or anything where you have a lot of finer details. Go ahead and put it on the big, broader parts instead. Then let it cure for about an hour until it's tacky, but not sticky and not completely done. How long that takes depends on the temperature in the room, so you'll have to come back and test it fairly often. Some people say it'll be done in about 20 minutes, but I usually keep my house cooler, so it can take up to an hour or more for me. When it's time for the second layer, go ahead and mix up more of the product. You're going to be making a thicker layer this time, so you'll need more material. And in this case, I didn't want to fill up a whole bunch of little medicine cups, so I used these clear cups to measure it. I just tried to get an equal amount in both cups, and you can see how much is in it because the cups are clear. If you make a whole lot of molds for some kind of business that you're running, then you probably want to use a gram scale instead in order to make sure that the amounts of both part A and part B are exactly the same. Once it's mixed up really well, add a few drops of that 5X stuff. It doesn't take very much. Just put a little bit in there and stir it again. It'll thicken up really fast, so you'll be able to tell if it's thick enough. If it isn't, go ahead and put in a little bit more. Now the consistency that you're looking for is something that won't run too much like the first layer did, but you still want it to be soft enough so that it goes down into the details like the eyes and the nostrils. So just add just a tiny little bit at a time until you get it the way you want it. Then use your popsicle stick to apply it to the model. I didn't have enough of the thickened silicone to fill in the undercut around the fox's muzzle. And you can't have any undercuts on the outside of your mold unless you make a two-part plaster shell, because you have to get the silicone mold out of the stiff plaster shell when you also have a stiff paper strips and paste mask on the inside of it. So you just can't have any undercuts. You really have to fill that in. So I just went ahead and let the first layer of the thickened stuff cure. It took about an hour, and then I made another small batch of the thickened Rebound 25, and I filled in all those undercuts and added more material around the clay dam, and that was enough for me. I let it dry overnight. You really do want it to cure completely. And then I used plaster cloth to create a stiff shell that holds the flexible silicone mold in the right shape. If you use your mold for production work, you're going to want a stiffer shell. I never do. This is really easy, so this is the way I always do it. But some people do use wet plaster that's reinforced with burlap, and some people use a much more expensive epoxy product on the outside. In a couple of hours, I was able to pull the plaster cloth off of the silicone mold because it gets hard really fast. And then I very carefully pulled the silicone mold off of the clay model, and now it was ready to start putting the paper strips and paste on the inside and make my paper mache copy of the clay model. I use wood glue instead of paste because it dries really quick and it's strong. But if you want to try using flour and water paste instead, experiment with it to make sure that it dries all the way through without causing the drying paper mache to curl up while it's drying, or to change its shape or get warped. That can sometimes happen when flour and water paste is only drying on one side. Also, you want to make sure that your paste is going to stick to the areas of the mask. Like I've got an area right at the end of his muzzle where the paper mache is going on kind of upside down. If the paste that you're using is too slick, then your paper strips and paste are just going to slip off. So make sure that whatever paste you use isn't going to cause that problem. I use wood glue because it works. That's what I use, and so that's what I'm doing for this demonstration. I put about 1/8 of a cup into the container, and I mixed in about a tablespoon of water. I just wanted to thin it out just a little bit. Not a lot, just a little. And I always use gloves because it feels weird when the glue starts to dry on your hands. I like to start out with really small pieces in the most detailed areas, and in this case that's going to be the nose. I always want to do the hard part first. And in this case, even the smallest pieces of the paper wouldn't go around the bumps for the nostrils. So I went ahead and filled in all around the nose and in the muzzle. I tried to push the paper as tight against the mold as I could, but once I had the muzzle pretty much covered with my first small pieces of paper, then I went back over those nostrils with tiny pieces of 1-ply paper towel. That paper is soft enough that it would go around that little bump, so that worked out just fine. It's a slightly different texture than the brown paper, of course, but it won't make any difference on the inside of a nostril. I used bigger pieces on the rest of the mold, being really careful to smooth it out as much as possible. I do have a video that shows you exactly how to make paper strips and paste go over all of the details and lay down really flat. That video shows you how to do it on the outside of a mask, but exactly the same tips will work on the inside of a mold too. So be sure and watch that. I'll put a link to it down below. In this demonstration, I went ahead and used 2 layers. Once I had everything covered with the first layer, I went back and put another layer of the brown paper over it. You're probably going to need a whole lot more layers than just 2, but you'll have to experiment to see exactly how many, because it really depends on what you're using them for. I let my paper mache dry overnight. You can tell that it's dry all the way through when it's really easy to pull the paper mache away from the mold. If it's at all damp inside, it's going to hang on to the mold. So if you keep tugging and pulling, even though there's just a little bit in there that isn't dry yet, then you're going to end up with a crumpled mess. So don't do that. Because I let mine dry overnight in front of a heating vent, it was dry all the way through and it came out really easy. So this is how he looks with his ears attached again. I would want to make some fur marks. I think I would use just put some paste down and then put tissue paper over it, kind of wrinkle it down so that it made nice ridges and creases that look like fur. And I would make some eyebrows, probably with some air-dried clay. There's an awful lot of expression in a canine, as you know, if you've got a dog at home, and their eyebrows are moving around all the time. And so if you put those in different places on the outside of your finished casting, then every single one of them will look different, which is really cool. Now, if you have any questions at all about this process, please do leave questions down below. I try to answer as many as I possibly can, as quickly as I can, although I am sometimes a little bit slow. I will answer one of them though right away. If you want to know if you can use a silicone mold to use paper mache clay inside instead of paper strips and paste, the answer to that unfortunately is no, it doesn't work. It's got too much texture and it doesn't make a good casting. But some people have told me that small items can be made with the air dry clay recipe on my website. It doesn't have as much texture. It evidently works really well in small silicone molds. I think they're using like the candy molds. I don't know if it would work in something this big. If anyone has actually used the air dry clay recipe in a bigger mold, please let us know if it works. Otherwise, if nobody has yet, you'd have to do some experiment to find out, because I've never tried it. I also have another video that shows you how to make my instant paper mache recipe. It's too heavy for a mask, but it works really well for wall sculpture, so I'm going to put a link to that down below too. And in the meantime, go make something and come visit me, ultimatepapermache.com. See you there.